June 15, 1943, 11:30 in the morning. Japanese housewife Sachiko Tanaka stands at the window of her modest home overlooking Shimonoseki Port, watching with genuine excitement as a transport ship unloads what appears to be a group of young Korean women whose traditional clothing and dignified bearing suggest they are accomplished entertainers arriving to perform the classical dances, songs, and cultural presentations that have been increasingly rare since the war began consuming Japan's resources and attention. Sachiko has been looking forward to Korean cultural performances for months, having heard rumors that military authorities were arranging for traditional entertainment that would provide civilian populations with moral support and cultural enrichment during difficult wartime conditions that have eliminated most forms of artistic expression and community celebration that previously enriched Japanese social life. The women descending from the ship appear to range in age from perhaps 16 to 25, wearing the kind of elegant hanbok garments that suggest professional training in traditional Korean arts, and their careful, measured movements reinforce Sachiko's assumption that she is witnessing the arrival of skilled cultural ambassadors, whose performances will honor the ancient artistic traditions that connect Korea and Japan through shared heritage. Park Hae-young, whose name Sachiko doesn't know, moves down the gangplank with the careful control of someone whose survival depends on maintaining appearances that contradict internal reality. Understanding that any deviation from expected behavior could result in severe punishment from military escorts, who have made clear that Korean women must project image of willing cultural cooperation rather than revealing their status as victims of systematic sexual slavery. Hae-young cannot explain to curious Japanese civilians that she and 19 other Korean women have been transported to Japan not as entertainers, but as comfort women whose forced sexual service will support military morale while demonstrating Japanese racial superiority through systematic degradation of Korean women whose cultural dignity has been weaponized to serve institutional objectives that reduce human beings to tactical assets. The traditional clothing that Hae-young wears represents elaborate deception designed to prevent Japanese civilian populations from recognizing systematic sexual slavery that operates within their communities, creating plausible cover story about cultural exchange while concealing institutional abuse that would create moral complications if discovered by civilian populations whose support for military policies depends on ignorance about specific methods used to achieve strategic objectives. In ignorance, evil hides behind familiar facades. Systematic atrocities often operate most effectively when concealed within institutional structures that appear legitimate, normal, and consistent with cultural expectations that prevent civilian populations from recognizing evidence of systematic abuse that exists within their communities, while serving strategic objectives through methods that violate fundamental moral principles. But sometimes, discovering truth transforms witnesses into moral guardians. Sometimes, the gradual revelation of systematic evil creates individual and collective responsibility for responding to institutional abuse, when ignorance gives way to knowledge that demands moral choice between complicity and resistance, between institutional loyalty and humanitarian obligation that transcends national boundaries and military classifications. The comfort women system operating throughout the Japanese Empire represented one of the most extensive programs of systematic sexual slavery in modern history, involving hundreds of thousands of women from Korea, China, Philippines, and other occupied territories who were forced to provide sexual services to Japanese military personnel under conditions that constituted systematic rape designed to serve military morale while demonstrating racial superiority. The transportation of Korean comfort women to Japan itself represented escalation of systematic abuse that brought war crimes directly into Japanese civilian communities, creating proximity between perpetrators and victims that required elaborate deception to prevent civilian recognition of institutional evil that operated within familiar social frameworks while serving military rather than cultural purposes. Sachiko's community in Shimonoseki had been selected for comfort station operations because of its strategic location, civilian population that could provide cover for military facilities, and distance from major urban centers where international observers might document systematic abuse that violated international law while serving strategic objectives through methods that required secrecy and civilian ignorance. The entertainment industry cover story that military authorities had developed to explain Korean women's presence reflected sophisticated understanding of Japanese cultural expectations about artistic exchange, traditional performance, and cultural cooperation that could provide plausible explanation for foreign women's presence while concealing systematic sexual slavery that served military rather than cultural purposes. Japanese civilian attitudes toward Korean culture included complex mixture of appreciation for traditional arts, recognition of historical connections between Korean and Japanese cultural traditions, and contemporary political beliefs about Korean subordination to Japanese leadership that had been systematically promoted through educational and propaganda systems designed to justify occupation policies and colonial administration. Sachiko's personal interest in Korean cultural performances reflected genuine appreciation for traditional arts, combined with wartime longing for cultural enrichment that had been eliminated by military mobilization, resource allocation, and social policies that prioritized military objectives over civilian welfare, and cultural activities that previously provided community cohesion and individual satisfaction. The deception that military authorities had created to conceal comfort station operations included detailed planning about civilian interaction, community integration, and cultural presentation that would prevent discovery of systematic abuse while maintaining operational security that protected institutional objectives from civilian interference or international observation that might compromise strategic effectiveness. Do you think Sachiko's assumption about Korean entertainers reflected innocent cultural appreciation? Or do you think it revealed willful ignorance that allowed Japanese civilians to avoid confronting evidence of systematic abuse that operated within their communities, while serving military objectives through methods that required civilian complicity and institutional deception? The gradual revelation of comfort station reality began when Sachiko noticed inconsistencies in the Korean women's behavior, appearance, and circumstances that suggested something other than voluntary cultural work, including signs of fear, malnutrition, and psychological trauma that seemed inappropriate for accomplished entertainers whose presence should have created anticipation rather than generating restrictions and military supervision. The community preparation for presumed Korean cultural performances included discussions about traditional arts, arrangements for community gathering spaces, and anticipation of educational opportunities that would provide cultural enrichment during wartime conditions that had eliminated most forms of artistic expression and community celebration that previously connected Japanese civilians to broader cultural traditions. The military restrictions that prevented civilian contact with Korean women gradually revealed themselves as inconsistent with cultural exchange programs, including armed guards, restricted movement, and prohibition of community interaction that suggested security rather than cultural concerns, while contradicting assumptions about voluntary entertainment work that should have encouraged rather than prevented civilian participation. The observations that Sachiko and other community members made about Korean women's condition included recognition of obvious malnutrition, signs of physical abuse, and psychological responses that contradicted assumptions about professional entertainers whose work should have provided adequate compensation and appropriate treatment rather than suggesting systematic exploitation and institutional abuse. The absence of promised cultural performances gradually created community speculation about the true purpose of Korean women's presence. with some civilians beginning to question official explanations, while others maintained willful ignorance that avoided confronting uncomfortable possibilities about systematic abuse that might operate within their communities while serving military objectives. The accidental discovery that revealed comfort station reality occurred when Sachiko witnessed Korean women being escorted to military facility under circumstances that clearly indicated sexual rather than cultural service, creating undeniable evidence of systematic abuse that contradicted all official explanations about entertainment work and cultural exchange programs that had been used to justify their presence. The moral shock that Sachiko experienced upon discovering systematic sexual slavery operating within her community included recognition of elaborate deception that had concealed institutional evil while exploiting civilian ignorance and cultural assumptions to prevent community awareness of war crimes that violated fundamental human dignity and international law. The individual responses among Japanese civilians to comfort station discovery varied widely, ranging from moral outrage and attempts to provide assistance to willful denial and continued support for military policies, demonstrating complex relationship between individual conscience and institutional loyalty when systematic evil operates within familiar community frameworks. The attempts that some Japanese civilians made to provide covert assistance to Korean comfort women included sharing food, offering medical supplies, and expressing sympathy within constraints imposed by military authority and community pressure that discouraged individual resistance to institutional policies that served strategic rather than humanitarian objectives. The growing awareness among civilian populations of systematic comfort women operations throughout Japanese-occupied territories created moral crisis that challenged fundamental assumptions about military honor, national purpose, and individual responsibility for institutional evil that operated within democratic societies while serving strategic objectives through methods that violated proclaimed values. The transformation that Sachiko experienced from innocent cultural enthusiast to moral witness included recognition of her own complicity in systematic deception, understanding of institutional manipulation that had exploited civilian ignorance, and acceptance of individual responsibility for responding to systematic abuse despite personal risk and community pressure. The community divisions that emerged over civilian responsibility for comfort women abuse reflected broader questions about individual versus collective guilt, the relationship between ignorance and complicity, and moral obligations that transcended national loyalty when institutional policies violated fundamental human dignity and international law. The small acts of kindness that some Japanese civilians provided to Korean comfort women included gestures of human recognition that acknowledged their dignity despite systematic dehumanization, demonstrating individual capacity for moral choice, even within institutional frameworks that demanded compliance with systematic abuse and cultural deception. The recognition that developed among some Japanese civilians of shared victimization by militaristic system included understanding that comfort women abuse represented extreme example of institutional policies that affected all populations through resource allocation, social control, and ideological manipulation that served military rather than civilian welfare. The post-war moral reckoning that Japanese communities faced regarding comfort women abuse included questions about civilian knowledge, individual responsibility, and collective guilt that challenged comfortable narratives about wartime experience while demanding acknowledgement of systematic evil that had operated within familiar social frameworks. The documentation that emerged after the war about civilian knowledge of comfort women operations revealed complex patterns of awareness, denial, and complicity that challenged simple distinctions between perpetrators and victims while illustrating how systematic evil could operate within democratic societies through institutional deception and civilian ignorance. The testimony that Korean comfort women survivors provided about Japanese civilian responses included accounts of both kindness and indifference, illustrating complex human dynamics that characterized systematic abuse situations where individual moral choice operated within institutional constraints that discouraged resistance while demanding compliance with policies that violated fundamental human dignity. The broader implications of civilian discovery of comfort women abuse included recognition that systematic evil requires not only institutional implementation, but also civilian complicity through ignorance, denial, or passive acceptance of policies that serve strategic objectives while violating proclaimed moral values and international legal obligations. Sachiko's post-war life included continued advocacy for comfort women recognition while working to educate Japanese society about systematic abuse that had operated within civilian communities, carrying forward moral awakening that had transformed her from innocent bystander to committed witness who acknowledged both individual and collective responsibility for institutional evil. Hee Young's survival of comfort station abuse included post-war testimony about Japanese civilian responses that ranged from genuine kindness to willful ignorance, demonstrating complex relationship between individual compassion and institutional complicity that characterized systematic abuse situations where personal moral choice operated within frameworks that discouraged resistance. The memorial that was eventually established to honor comfort women victims included recognition of Japanese civilians who had provided assistance despite personal risk, acknowledging individual moral courage while maintaining accountability for systematic evil that had operated within civilian communities through institutional deception and cultural manipulation. The education programs that developed from post-war moral reckoning included instruction about recognizing systematic abuse, individual responsibility for institutional evil, and moral obligations that transcend national loyalty when fundamental human dignity requires protection rather than compliance with policies that serve strategic rather than humanitarian objectives. The cultural performances that Sachiko had originally anticipated never occurred, but the moral awakening that replaced her innocent expectations created lasting commitment to protecting vulnerable populations and recognizing systematic abuse that operates within familiar institutional frameworks while serving objectives that violate fundamental human dignity and international legal obligations. In the end, the entertainment that Japanese civilians had expected to celebrate Korean culture instead revealed systematic abuse that exploited cultural symbols to conceal institutional evil, demonstrating how familiar facades could hide systematic atrocities while requiring civilian ignorance and complicity for continued operation within democratic societies. The transformation from cultural anticipation to moral recognition illustrated that civilian responsibility for systematic evil extended beyond direct participation to include willful ignorance, passive acceptance, and failure to investigate evidence that suggested institutional abuse operating within familiar community frameworks while serving strategic rather than humanitarian objectives. The Korean women who had been mistaken for entertainers became teachers who revealed truths about systematic abuse that challenged comfortable assumptions about national honor, military policy, and individual responsibility for institutional evil that required civilian complicity to operate effectively within democratic societies that proclaimed commitment to human dignity and international law. The discovery that systematic sexual slavery had operated within Japanese civilian communities, while disguised as cultural exchange, demonstrated that authentic cultural understanding required acknowledgement of systematic abuse, rather than maintenance of comfortable deceptions that allowed institutional evil to continue operating through civilian ignorance and institutional manipulation of cultural symbols and community expectations.